I'm Daniel Malakauskas, owner of Malakauskas Law, an immigration law firm. Today, I'll be answering some questions about an immigration document known as a Consular Report of Birth Abroad. What is a Consular Report of Birth Abroad? A Consular Report of Birth Abroad is a document that proves citizenship. A Consular Report of Birth Abroad is given to U.S. citizens that were born outside of the United States. By contrast, a birth certificate is given to U.S. citizens born inside the United States. Since you do not get a United States birth certificate if you are born outside the United States, you need a Consular Report of Birth Abroad to prove that you are a U.S. citizen. What qualifies for a Consular Report of Birth Abroad? A child born to a U.S. citizen in a foreign country generally qualifies for a Consular Report of Birth Abroad. In the United States, citizenship can be passed down from parents to their children. This is true whether the parent gave birth to the children either inside or outside of the United States. If you are born to a parent who was a U.S. citizen at the time of birth, you likely qualify for a Consular Report of Birth Abroad. What is the difference between a Consular Report of Birth Abroad and a certificate of citizenship? Like a Consular Report of Birth Abroad, a certificate of citizenship is a document that proves citizenship. A certificate of citizenship is also given to U.S. citizens who were born outside of the United States. However, a Consular Report of Birth Abroad and a certificate of citizenship are two different things. A Consular Report of Birth Abroad is given to U.S. citizens who apply for their proof of citizenship before their 18th birthday. By contrast, a certificate of citizenship is given to U.S. citizens who apply for proof of their citizenship after their 18th birthday. In addition, the Consular Report of Birth Abroad application is submitted by the parents of the U.S. citizen. By contrast, the certificate of citizenship application is submitted by the U.S. citizen themselves. Can I get a U.S. passport with a Consular Report of Birth Abroad? Yes, a Consular Report of Birth Abroad is proof that you are a U.S. citizen. Therefore, so long as you meet the other requirements, you can use a Consular Report of Birth Abroad to obtain a U.S. passport. How do I get a Consular Report of Birth Abroad? You get a Consular Report of Birth Abroad by filling out an application. The application is entitled Application for a Consular Report of Birth Abroad of a Citizen of the United States of America. The application requires supporting documentation and may require additional forms depending on the facts of your specific situation. The paper version of the Consular Report of Birth Abroad application is known as Form DS-2029. What documents are required for a Consular Report of Birth Abroad? The supporting documents you will need depend upon your specific situation. However, common supporting documents often include birth certificates, marriage certificates, death certificates, forms of identification, evidences of residency, evidences of your financial condition, travel documentation, and other miscellaneous documents. However, not all these documents will be required for every application. In addition, specific circumstances may require additional documentation. Finally, if the documents are in a foreign language, you will need them to be translated into English. What are the requirements for a Consular Report of Birth Abroad? You can acquire a consular report of birth abroad if you are a U.S. citizen who was not born inside the United States. If you are born outside of the United States, generally you must meet one of the requirements found under 8 U.S.C. 1401. In plain language, before you were born, at least one of your parents must have been a U.S. citizen and must have spent some time inside the United States. How long your parent must have spent on the inside of the United States depends upon whether one or both parents were U.S. citizens. If both parents are U.S. citizens, only one must have had residence inside the United States prior to your birth. If one of your parents is a U.S. citizen and one of them is a national, then the U.S. citizen parent must have had residence inside the United States for at least 1 year prior to your birth. If only one parent is a U.S. citizen, then that parent must have had U.S. residence for at least 5 years prior to your birth, with at least 2 of those years being after they reached the age of 14. How do I get a copy of my consular report of birth abroad? When you apply for a U.S. consular report of birth abroad, you are given the option to have your report mailed to you or to pick it up at the consular office. You get to decide the preferred method of obtaining the report. However, if you have already received the consular report of birth abroad and you need a copy due to you having lost the original, you may apply with the U.S. Department of State's Vital Records Department. How do I replace a consular report of birth abroad? In order to replace a consular report of birth abroad, you must file a request for overseas U.S. citizen vital records services application with the U.S. Department of State. You will be required to provide notarized documentation with the application. How do I obtain a birth certificate if I was born abroad? You cannot obtain a U.S. birth certificate if you are born outside of the United States. You will obtain a birth certificate from the country, regional government, or hospital from which you were born. A U.S. birth certificate or birth certificate from a U.S. state, county, or hospital can only be obtained by being born inside the United States. If you are born outside of the United States, you need to obtain a consular report of birth abroad or a certificate of citizenship. Thank you for watching. Please comment, like, or subscribe.